I sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, looking at the people I used to call family. The room was dead silent, the kind of heavy silence that happens right before a bomb goes off. The air conditioning hummed faintly, but all I could hear was the steady beating of my own heart. My wife's funeral was barely a memory, and already the vultures were circling above me. My daughter-in-law, Monica, leaned forward, placing both her hands flat on the polished wood. She did not look like a grieving relative. She looked like a predator who had just cornered her exhausted prey. She slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the table, the sharp smack echoing loudly in the quiet room. She smiled coldly, a look of pure arrogance. "Now that the old woman is gone," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "you will put the company in my son's name and fend for yourself. You are done here, Richard. It is our turn now." I looked at my son Derek sitting right beside her. He looked down at his expensive shoes. Too much of a coward to meet his father's eyes. They thought they had me completely backed into a corner. They truly believed a grieving 70-year-old man was an easy target. But they forgot exactly who built the empire they were trying to steal. I did not yell. I did not argue. I simply smiled, folded my hands together, and waited. Exactly 3 seconds later, the heavy boardroom doors swung open. My lawyer, Victor Lang, walked into the room. He did not say a single word. He just walked straight up to the table and dropped a certified DNA test right in front of Monica. "Before I tell you what that piece of paper said and how I utterly destroyed the people who tried to bury me alive, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to stand up and teach an ungrateful family member a lesson they will never forget." To understand how we ended up in that tense boardroom, you have to go back exactly 3 days. The sweet scent of funeral lies still hung thick in the air of my home. My Diane was gone. 45 years of beautiful marriage, cut short by pancreatic cancer in a matter of a few brutal months. The house was painfully quiet now, empty in a way that made my chest physically ache. I stood alone at the kitchen sink, letting the warm water run over my hands as I washed a simple drinking glass. It was a mindless task, something to keep my hands busy, so my mind would not wander back to the empty chair in our living room. The granite counter felt cold under my hands. Diane had picked out that granite. She loved this kitchen, and now someone who never truly respected her was standing on her floor, demanding the fruits of her lifelong labor. That was when I heard the sharp, rapid click of expensive heels echoing on the hardwood floor. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands. Monica strutted into the kitchen. There was not a single tear in her eyes. There was not a trace of sorrow on her perfectly made-up face. She was dressed in a sharp black designer suit, looking more like she was heading to a hostile corporate takeover than mourning the passing of her mother-in-law. Without a single word of comfort, without even bothering to ask how I was holding up after the hardest week of my life, she dropped a thick manila folder onto the counter. The sound was loud and deliberate. I looked down at the folder. Printed across the top page in bold black letters were the words "Emergency Handover and Succession Agreement." I looked from the paper back up to Monica. "What is this, Monica?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. She sighed, an exaggerated theatrical sigh, acting exactly as if she were dealing with a stubborn child. "It is for your own good, Richard," she said smoothly, leaning against the counter. "You are 70 years old. You just lost Diane. You are grieving, and you are in no condition to run Caldwell Logistics right now. You need to sign this agreement today so we can transfer the executive powers to Chase." Chase was my 18-year-old grandson, a boy who had barely managed to graduate high school and spent more time taking pictures of his sports cars for social media than he ever spent looking at a financial balance sheet. I stared at the legal document, feeling a cold, hard knot form deep in my stomach. Caldwell Logistics was not just a company to me. It was the blood, the sweat, and the tears of my entire adult life. Diane and I built that $15 million empire from a single rusty delivery truck back in 1985. We did not have wealthy investors. We had exactly $100 in our bank account, and a shared dream. We spent our 20s eating cold sandwiches in freezing parking lots, sleeping in the cramped cab of that truck, and fighting tooth and nail for every single client we ever had. Diane kept the books on a fold-out table, while I drove through blizzards to make deliveries. And now, only 3 days after I buried the woman who helped me build all of it, my daughter-in-law wanted me to hand the keys over to a teenager so she could pull the strings from the shadows. I did not raise my voice. I did not show her my anger. In business, the one who loses their temper is the one who loses the negotiation. I just looked at her and said, "The company is running just fine. I am grieving, Monica. I am not incapacitated." Right on cue, my son Derek walked into the kitchen. He was 42 years old, but standing next to his overbearing wife, he looked like a frightened little boy waiting for orders. He stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, putting on a highly rehearsed mask of deep concern. He was wearing a custom suit I bought for him, living a comfortable life I completely funded. Yet here he was trying to put me out to pasture before the dirt on his mother's grave had even settled. "Dad, please just listen to her," Derek said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "The doctor said your blood pressure has been dangerously high since Mom got sick. We are terribly worried about you. We do not want to lose you, too. Just sign the papers. Let Chase hold the title in the family trust, and Monica and I will handle all the daily operations for the company. You can finally rest and take care of yourself. You do not have to worry about a single thing anymore." It sounded so incredibly caring. It was the perfect plausible lie. A loving son and a concerned daughter-in-law stepping up to take a massive burden off an old man's shoulders. But I knew Derek better than anyone. I had spent millions of dollars on his elite Ivy League education, only to watch him become a weak man who could not make a single major decision without his wife's explicit permission. I looked at the expensive gold pen Monica had conveniently placed right next to the folder. "I will think about it," I said quietly, stepping back from the counter. "I need some time to read through the legal clauses before I sign anything." Derek nodded eagerly, clearly relieved that I had not flatly refused their demand. "Of course, Dad. Take all the time you need," he said, forcing a warm smile. "Just do not wait too long. The market is very volatile right now, and the company needs steady leadership." They turned around together and walked out of the kitchen, their footsteps fading down the long hallway, leaving me alone with the stack of papers. I stood frozen by the counter, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in my chest. I turned my head slowly toward the large bay window that looked out into the corridor. The glass was dark against the evening sky, acting like a perfect clear mirror. In the reflection, I saw Monica pause near the front door. She pulled her phone out of her designer purse and quickly began to type a message. She had absolutely no idea that I could see her reflection perfectly from where I stood. I watched closely as her fingers flew across the digital screen. I did not even need to guess what she was doing, because as she hit the send button, she muttered the words under her breath with a vicious, triumphant smirk on her face. "The old man took the bait," she whispered to herself, tucking the phone away. "Prep the chairs." I stood alone in my quiet, empty kitchen, the warm water still dripping slowly from the faucet. They honestly thought I was a broken, clueless old widower who would just roll over and give up. They thought they had outsmarted me in my own home, but they were about to learn a very hard lesson. A lone wolf might lose his mate, but he never loses his teeth. And I was about to bite back hard. The next morning, I woke up before the sun considered rising. I did not sleep much. The silence of the house without Diane was suffocating. The heavy realization of my own family conspiring against me made the air feel even thinner. I needed the familiar hum of my empire to clear my head. I needed to stand in the halls of Caldwell Logistics and remember exactly who I was before I became an old widower in the eyes of my greedy children. By 6 in the morning, I was pulling my car into the executive parking lot. The crisp morning air felt sharp against my face as I walked up to the towering glass building. This place was my sanctuary. I had poured every ounce of my energy into these walls. I walked through the quiet lobby, nodding to the night shift security guard, and took the private elevator straight up to the executive floor. I bypassed my own office and headed directly for the executive archives at the end of the corridor. The archives held the backup records of every major financial transaction and trust document associated with Caldwell Logistics. If Monica and Derek were planning a hostile takeover, they would need to alter the foundational operating agreements. I reached the heavy security door and pulled my master key card from my pocket. I swiped the plastic card against the electronic reader, expecting the familiar green light and the mechanical click of the unlocking mechanism. Instead, the keypad beeped a harsh, flat tone. The small light blinked a solid, angry red. Access denied. I stared at the glowing digital panel. My card was the master key. It was programmed to never expire and to grant unlimited access to every single room in the building. I swiped the card a second time. The reader beeped again. Red light access denied. I swiped it a third time, pressing the plastic against the sensor. Red light access completely denied. Are you having some trouble with the door, Richard? The voice came from the shadows near the break room, startlingly loud in the quiet hallway. I turned around slowly. Stepping out into the dim morning light was Bradley Jenkins. Bradley was our chief financial officer. He was 45 years old and wore custom-tailored suits. He was wearing far too much expensive cologne. The heavy scent of musk and cedar rolled off him in waves that made my stomach turn. He walked toward me with a rehearsed plastic smile plastered across his face. He looked entirely too awake and far too comfortable for 6 in the morning. Bradley, I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and steady. My master key card seems to be malfunctioning. It is rejecting my clearance for the executive archives. Bradley stopped a few feet away from me, tucking his manicured hands into his pockets. Oh, right, he said, his smile widening just a fraction. I should have warned you. We are running a massive system update on the security servers this weekend. Derek ordered a complete overhaul of the digital access protocols to ensure our corporate data remains secure. The system is temporarily restricting access to all sensitive areas while the technicians migrate the files. Derek ordered it. I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the empty corridor. Bradley nodded smoothly, completely unfazed. Yes. Derek thought it was best to handle the security migration now. He mentioned you would be taking an extended leave of absence to mourn Diane, so he took the initiative to approve the technology overhaul. Do not worry about a thing, Richard. We have everything completely under control. You should go home and get some rest. I looked into Bradley Jenkins' eyes. They were cold, calculating, and full of silent mockery. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew that I knew. They were locking me out of my own company. They were building a digital fortress to hide whatever financial crimes they were currently committing. They were using my son as the face of the operation. The old Richard would have grabbed Bradley by his silk tie and thrown him through the glass doors. I would have demanded the security team break the archive lock immediately. But the man standing there now was a seasoned corporate veteran. If I caused a scene, I would show my hand. I would give them a reason to claim I was acting erratically due to grief. I would give Monica exactly what she needed to prove I was mentally unfit to lead. I am not going to argue with you, Bradley, I said smoothly, forcing a polite nod. I suppose a security update is long overdue. Tell Derek I appreciate his sudden interest in our data protection. I turned my back on the chief financial officer and walked calmly toward my private office. I could feel his arrogant gaze burning into my back as I walked away, but I did not look back. I stepped into my office and locked the heavy oak door behind me. I sat down in my leather chair. They thought shutting off my key card would blind me. They thought they controlled the flow of information because they controlled the modern servers, but they fundamentally misunderstood how an old wolf protects his territory. I reached down and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I pressed my thumb against a biometric scanner hidden underneath the wooden panel. A small click echoed in the quiet room. A secret compartment slid open. Inside rested a thick, dust-covered external hard drive. I did not need their network access. 10 years ago, anticipating corporate espionage, I had a backdoor coded directly into the mainframe. This hard drive contained an offline mirror of every digital skeleton buried in Caldwell logistics. I connected the heavy drive to my secure laptop. The screen flickered to life, prompting me for a sequence of encrypted passwords. Only I knew. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I was moments away from bypassing their pathetic firewall and exposing whatever rot Monica and Bradley were hiding in my financial records. I took a deep breath, ready to strike the first blow in this silent war. Before my finger could press the enter key, the sharp ringing of my private cell phone shattered the silence. I jumped slightly, pulling my hand back from the keyboard. Very few people had this personal number. Absolutely, no one should be calling it at 6:30 in the morning. I pulled the phone from my jacket pocket and looked at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed the name of the local county hospital. A cold wave of dread washed over me. Hospitals do not call at dawn with good news. I accepted the call and lifted the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Richard Caldwell," a woman asked. Her tone was strictly professional, but carried an undeniable weight of urgency. "This is the emergency department at Memorial Hospital. I am calling regarding your grandson, Chase Caldwell. He has been in a severe motorcycle accident. He is currently in the trauma unit, and we need family members here immediately." I slammed the laptop shut and shoved the encrypted hard drive back into the hidden compartment of my heavy oak desk. The digital war for Caldwell Logistics would simply have to wait. My grandson was currently bleeding. I grabbed my car keys with shaking hands, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I sprinted out of my private office, completely ignoring the confused and annoyed look on Bradley Jenkins' face as I rushed past the corporate break room. I slammed my hand against the elevator button, my mind racing with terrifying images of Chase lying broken on the cold asphalt. He was a reckless teenager with far too much money and far too little sense, but he was still my family. He was the only heir Diane had truly doted on during her final years. The drive to Memorial Hospital was a terrifying blur of flashing traffic lights, blaring horns, and reckless swerves through the morning traffic. I broke every single speed limit in the city, gripping the cold leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white and my forearms ached with tension. I pushed the accelerator all the way to the floorboard, praying silently that I would not be too late. I abandoned my car in the emergency drop-off zone, not caring about the parking violation, and burst through the sliding glass doors of the hospital. The harsh fluorescent lights of the trauma ward stung my tired eyes. The overwhelming smell of cheap antiseptic and stale waiting room coffee filled the chilly morning air. I spotted them immediately at the far end of the long sterile hallway. Monica was pacing back and forth, her expensive designer heels clicking a sharp rhythmic tempo against the polished linoleum floor. She was furiously typing on her smartphone, looking significantly more inconvenienced than devastated. Derek sat slumped in an uncomfortable plastic waiting room chair with his head buried deep in his hands. His tailored suit was severely wrinkled, and his broad shoulders shook slightly under the bright hospital lights. I hurried down the hallway, my heavy footsteps announcing my sudden arrival. Derek looked up, his face extremely pale and slick with a nervous sweat. "Dad," he choked out, standing up quickly and wiping his hands on his trousers. "I got here as fast as I possibly could," I said, grabbing his shaking shoulders. "What exactly happened out there, and how bad is his condition right now?" Derek swallowed hard, his anxious eyes darting toward Monica, who had finally stopped typing to look at me with mild annoyance. "He took a sharp corner way too fast on that brand new sports motorcycle," Derek explained, his voice trembling noticeably. He lost control of the bike and slid directly into a steel guardrail on the busy highway. He was wearing his protective helmet, thank God, so there is no severe brain damage or spinal trauma, but he suffered a very deep laceration on his left thigh and some minor internal bruising around his ribs. He lost a significant amount of blood at the scene of the accident before the paramedics could arrive and apply a proper tourniquet. Monica aggressively crossed her arms over her chest, letting out a sharp, highly frustrated sigh that echoed loudly in the quiet corridor. "It is a complete and utter disaster, Richard. We were strictly scheduled to finalize the executive trust transfer this afternoon, and now we are stuck sitting in this miserable waiting room." I stared at her, completely appalled by her absolute lack of basic maternal concern. Her teenage son was lying on a surgical operating table, and she was only worried about a corporate handover schedule. Before I could formally reprimand her for her stunning callousness, the heavy double doors of the trauma bay swung open. A very tired-looking attending physician stepped out into the quiet waiting area. He wore blue surgical scrubs that were visibly stained with small, dark spots of fresh blood. His blue surgical mask was pulled down around his neck, revealing a deeply lined, physically exhausted face. "Family of Chase Caldwell," he called out loudly, his authoritative voice echoing down the hospital corridor. We rushed forward together, forming a tight, anxious circle around the exhausted medical professional. "He is medically stable for the moment," the physician said, holding up a thick metal clipboard and clicking his pen. "We managed to successfully stop the primary hemorrhaging in his upper leg, and his vital signs are currently holding steady on the monitors. However, his overall hemoglobin levels are dropping to a critically low point. We need to administer a massive blood transfusion immediately to prevent him from slipping into severe hypovolemic shock." Derek let out a loud, shuddering breath of profound relief, leaning heavily against the painted drywall for physical support. "Then do it immediately," Monica demanded, waving her manicured hand dismissively at the doctor. "Give him the required blood and patch him up quickly so we can finally get out of this depressing place. We have a private, luxurious recovery suite waiting for him at our home." The doctor frowned deeply, clearly unimpressed by Monica and her highly demanding, arrogant attitude. "It is not that simple, ma'am," he said, his professional tone growing noticeably firm and uncompromising. "Your son has a very rare and specific blood type. He is AB positive. Under normal daily circumstances, this would not be a massive logistical issue, but our hospital blood bank experienced an unprecedented shortage this week due to a multi-car pileup on the interstate. We simply do not have enough AB positive or universal donor blood in our immediate hospital inventory to safely and fully complete the required transfusion." He looked directly at Derek, then shifted his serious gaze to Monica. "We need direct family donors right now, immediately. The boy desperately needs blood, and he needs it flowing into his veins within the next hour to survive. We can bring you both into the lab and cross-match you immediately to save his life." The world around me seemed to halt completely. The low mechanical hum of the hospital ventilation system faded entirely away. The distant rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitors went dead in my ringing ears. The attending doctor's specific words echoed loudly in my mind, repeating over and over again like a broken skipping record. "A B positive. The boy is a B positive." My mind, rigorously trained over decades to analyze complex corporate data and detect absolute factual inconsistencies, immediately latched onto a monumental, undeniable biological impossibility. I am an O blood type. My beloved late wife Diane was an O blood type. By the absolute unbreakable scientific laws of human genetics, two biological parents with type O blood can only ever produce children with type O blood. Therefore, my biological son, Derek, was undeniably factually an O blood type. I knew this for an absolute fact. I vividly remembered the medical paperwork from his severe childhood appendectomy surgeries. Monica, I knew from a brief conversation years ago, during a minor family medical scare, was an A blood type. I stood perfectly still in the sterile hospital corridor, staring blankly at the white wall directly behind the doctor. Basic high school biology began to scream blaring alarms deep inside my head. An O blood type parent and an A blood type parent can naturally produce an A blood type child. They can occasionally produce an O blood type child, but they cannot under any conceivable scientific circumstance ever produce an AB positive child. The dominant BAL had to come from somewhere. It had to come directly from a biological father who actively carried the B genetic trait. Derek absolutely did not carry it. I absolutely did not carry it. Diane absolutely did not carry it. There was only one impossible, horrifying, devastating conclusion staring me right in the face in that bright hallway. The teenage boy bleeding out on the surgical operating table. The boy I had spoiled and loved and rigorously prepared to inherit my $15 million logistics empire did not have a single solitary drop of Caldwell blood running through his veins. Chase was not my biological grandson. I slowly turned my heavy head to look at Monica. She was furiously arguing with the tired doctor, loudly demanding he call another private hospital to fly the necessary blood in by an emergency helicopter. She was putting on a loud, incredibly aggressive performance to deliberately distract from the obvious urgent request for her to donate her own blood. She knew she could not donate without exposing the truth. Then I turned my cold gaze directly to my son. I fully expected to see a man confused by basic genetics. I fully expected to see a worried, grieving father questioning the doctor about a potential catastrophic laboratory error. Instead, what I saw chilled me to the absolute bone and shattered my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. Derek was backed firmly against the painted hospital wall, gripping the metal handrail with bone-white knuckles. He was not looking at the frustrated doctor. He was not looking at his screaming wife, Monica. He was staring firmly and intensely at the linoleum floor, his entire body trembling violently under his expensive suit. He was sweating profusely, beads of moisture rolling down his pale forehead. He was not confused by the science. He was utterly terrified. He knew, he absolutely, undeniably knew the genetic math did not add up. When he finally found the courage to lift his heavy head, he felt my intense eyes burning right into him. For one brief, absolutely terrifying second, our eyes met across the sterile corridor. He saw the cold, sharp realization settling permanently over my face. He saw that I had done the genetic math in my head and arrived at the truth. Derek immediately broke eye contact, looking away entirely, completely unable to face the father he was actively helping to destroy. The heavy silence in the sterile corridor was finally broken when Monica pulled out her platinum credit card. She shoved it aggressively toward the exhausted attending physician, demanding he contact a neighboring private medical facility and secure the necessary blood supply via an emergency helicopter transport, regardless of the exorbitant financial cost. The doctor, realizing he was dealing with people who firmly believed that money could effortlessly bend reality, nodded curtly and marched back into the busy trauma bay to make the necessary arrangements. With the immediate medical crisis temporarily diverted by the highly aggressive financial intervention of Monica, an uncomfortable, suffocating tension immediately settled over the three of us. We were no longer just a family waiting for a routine medical update. We were a family actively standing on a massive foundation of carefully constructed lies, and that foundation had just suffered a catastrophic structural fracture. I did not press the issue right there in the open hallway. Confronting a cornered animal in a completely open public space is a massive tactical error I learned to avoid decades ago during brutal corporate negotiations. Instead, I let the suffocating silence stretch out for a few more agonizing minutes. I looked at Derek, who was still flatly refusing to meet my eyes, and calmly suggested we get some coffee from the hospital cafeteria downstairs while we waited for the helicopter transport to arrive. He hesitated, his anxious eyes darting toward his wife for silent permission. Monica, already completely distracted by another incoming text message on her smartphone, waved her hand dismissively, telling him to go. She clearly wanted the space to conduct her own private business without my constantly observing eyes. Derek swallowed hard, nodded weakly, and obediently followed me toward the elevators. The hospital cafeteria was a bleak, depressing cavern located in the dark basement of the massive building. The harsh, flickering, fluorescent lights reflected poorly off the cheap linoleum floor, casting a sickly pale yellow glow over the scattered plastic tables. The overwhelming smell of burned coffee and strong industrial bleach hung heavily in the stale, recycled air. We purchased 2 cups of bitter, lukewarm coffee in flimsy styrofoam cups and found a secluded table in the far back corner of the desolate room. Derek sat across from me, gripping his cup tightly with both hands, as if the cheap styrofoam was the only thing keeping him tethered to the physical world. His broad shoulders were slumped, his expensive suit jacket hanging loosely over his defeated frame. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my terrible coffee, letting the intensely bitter taste wash over my tongue. I set the cup down and looked directly across the small table. So I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm, measured, and entirely free of accusation. That was certainly quite a tense moment up there with the attending physician. I suppose it is a good thing Monica was willing to cover the cost of the emergency transport. But I have to admit, Derek, I was a little confused by the medical details. The doctor was very clear that Chase is an AB positive blood type. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the sticky plastic table. Diane and I were both O blood types. You are an O blood type. Monica is an A. How exactly does a boy with those biological parents end up with AB positive blood? Derek flinched physically, exactly as if I had reached across the table and struck him directly across the face. The nervous sweat that had recently begun to dry on his forehead instantly returned in heavy, glistening beads. He squeezed the styrofoam cup so tightly that the hot coffee nearly spilled over the fragile rim. He did not give me a puzzled look. He did not express a genuine natural confusion over a potential laboratory mix-up. Instead, he reacted with immediate explosive hostility. He slammed the cup down onto the table, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate, defensive anger. You are grieving and confused, Dad. He snapped his face, flushing a deep, angry crimson. The laboratory made a simple typographical error on his medical chart. It happens all the time in these chaotic emergency rooms. Do not start your paranoid interrogations today. My son is lying in a hospital bed, and you are trying to turn a simple clerical mistake into a ridiculous conspiracy. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the full weight of his furious outburst. In the ruthless world of logistics and corporate acquisitions, I had sat across the table from hundreds of desperate men trying to hide terrible truths. I knew exactly what genuine confusion looked like. I knew exactly what righteous indignation looked like. And I knew exactly what a cornered, guilty coward looked like when the walls of his deception began to close in around him. Derek was not stupid, but he was an incredibly poor liar. He was hiding something massive, and his explosive, uncharacteristic aggression only served to completely confirm my absolute worst fear. If he truly believed it was a simple laboratory typo, he would have brushed off my questions with a tired sigh. He would have gently reminded me that clerical errors happen. But he attacked me. He used my fresh grief over Diane to deflect my very logical biological question. As I stared at the sweating, defensive man sitting across from me, a profound, heavy sadness washed over my soul. This was my son. This was the boy I had worked 80-hour weeks to provide for. While Diane and I were eating cold sandwiches in the cramped cab of our very first delivery truck, fighting to build Caldwell Logistics. From the ground up, we were dreaming of the future we could give this boy. We poured millions of dollars into his elite privileged upbringing. We paid for his exclusive privatomies, his lavish summer vacations, and his prestigious Ivy League education. We gave him absolutely every single advantage that we never had, hoping to forge a strong, intelligent, capable leader who could take our empire into the next generation. But all that money, all that privilege, and all that expensive education had only managed to produce a remarkably weak-willed follower. Derek had returned from his elite university not as a conqueror, but as a man completely devoid of a strong internal compass. He was a man who preferred the comfortable path of least resistance, a man who consistently deferred to the strongest personality in the room. And unfortunately for both of us, The strongest personality he had ever encountered was his manipulative, socially ambitious wife, Monica. She had quickly realized exactly how pliable he was, and she had spent the last 2 decades carefully molding him into a compliant, silent accessory to her own grand, greedy ambitions. He was not a partner in his own marriage. He was a hostage who had slowly fallen in love with his captor. I let the tense silence stretch between us, refusing to break eye contact, refusing to let him off the hook. "You are probably right, Derek," I finally said, my voice dropping to a soft, chilling whisper. "It must simply be a typographical error. After all, what other possible explanation could there be?" My words were carefully chosen, heavily layered with an unmistakable underlying threat. Derek swallowed visibly, his neck muscles bobbing sharply in his collar. He quickly averted his eyes completely, unable to sustain the intense, knowing pressure of my gaze. He mumbled a weak, incoherent agreement, blindly staring at the brown liquid swirling inside his cup. He knew that I knew, and he knew that he was entirely powerless to stop the storm that was rapidly gathering on the horizon. I stood up slowly from the flimsy plastic chair, leaving my untouched coffee on the table. "Take a moment to gather yourself, son," I said, buttoning my suit jacket with deliberate, measured movements. "I am going to head back upstairs to check on the arrival of the emergency transport." I walked away without waiting for a response, leaving him alone in the depressing, fluorescent-lit basement to drown in his own overwhelming guilt. I rode the slow, rumbling elevator back up to the trauma ward, my mind working through 1,000 different complex scenarios, calculating variables and mapping out potential legal and financial countermeasures. When the elevator doors slid open on the surgical floor, I stepped out into the quiet corridor. I did not immediately walk back to the waiting room area. Instead, I paused behind the thick concrete pillar near the nurse station, keeping myself completely concealed in the shadows. Further down the long, sterile hallway, standing near the large glass windows that overlooked the bustling city streets below, was Monica. She was whispering furiously into her smartphone, pacing wildly. It was absolutely not a laboratory typographical error. Chase is definitely not a biological Caldwell. I desperately need undeniable proof, and I know exactly how I will get it. The emergency helicopter arrived shortly after Monica made her frantic calls. The transfusion was an absolute success. Chase stabilized quickly, and within a few hours, the attending physician declared him out of the woods. By late afternoon, they discharged him with crutches, pain medication, and strict orders to rest in bed. I played the part of the relieved grandfather to absolute perfection. I hugged Derek, gave Monica a supportive smile, and told them I would check on them later. Then I went home and prepared for a different operation. I needed undeniable proof, and I needed it secured before they realized I was on to their deception. I purchased 2 large containers of chicken noodle soup, transferring them into my own glass containers to make it look like a homemade gesture. I slipped a pair of latex gloves and 3 sterile plastic bags into my wool overcoat. The sun had set by the time I pulled into the driveway of their home. It was an estate with manicured lawns and a stone facade entirely paid for by my money. I had written the down payment check 3 years ago to secure a stable environment for the boy I mistakenly believed was my flesh and blood. Now looking at the glowing windows, I felt a sense of violation. I walked up the stone steps and rang the heavy brass doorbell. Derek opened the door, looking drained and wearing the wrinkled suit from the hospital. "Dad," he said, his voice laced with surprise and a hint of anxiety. "You really did not have to come out here tonight. You should be resting." I held up the glass containers with a gentle smile. "I could not sleep, son," I said softly. "I know you both must be exhausted. I brought some warm soup so you do not have to worry about cooking dinner." Derek stepped aside, allowing me into the grand foyer. The house was quiet, the thick plush carpets absorbing the sound of my heavy footsteps. We walked into the kitchen. Monica was sitting at the marble island, a glass of red wine in one hand and a stack of hospital discharge papers in the other. She did not bother to stand up or greet me. Instead, She began to complain loudly about the exorbitant cost of the emergency medical transport she had demanded just hours earlier. "Can you believe the nerve of these private transport companies?" she scoffed, tossing a bill onto the counter. "They are charging us a premium for a 20-a-nut helicopter ride. It is highway robbery." I set the soup down on the counter, keeping my expression neutral. "Health and safety have no price tag, Monica," I replied smoothly. "We are blessed that Chase is resting comfortably upstairs." She rolled her eyes and took another sip of wine, missing the double meaning hidden in my words. Derek offered to heat up the soup. Moving slowly toward the kitchen stove, I seized the opportunity. "I am going to wash my hands and check in on the boy." For a brief moment, I said casually, turning away from the kitchen before either of them could offer an objection. I walked up the staircase, my heart beating with a cold, precise rhythm. The second floor was dimly lit and silent. I walked past the master bedroom and headed straight for the end of the long hallway, where Chase had his private suite. I pushed his bedroom door open just a fraction of an inch. He was fast asleep in his large bed, his injured leg propped up on a stack of soft pillows, a pair of noise-canceling headphones covering his ears. I quietly pulled the door shut and slipped directly into his private attached bathroom. The room smelled of expensive cologne and mint toothpaste. I reached into my overcoat pocket and pulled out the sterile plastic bags and the surgical latex gloves. I snapped the gloves over my hands, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man completely focused on his mission. I opened the mirrored medicine cabinet above the porcelain sink. There, resting in a sleek ceramic holder, was his blue electric toothbrush. The bristles were still slightly damp from recent use. It was a perfect, uncontaminated source of raw genetic material. I carefully extracted the toothbrush, making absolutely sure not to touch the bristlehead, and dropped it directly into the first sterile plastic bag. I sealed the tight plastic zipper shut, locked the evidence away in my deep pocket, and closed the medicine cabinet without making a single sound. That was half the battle. Now I needed Derek. I peeled the latex gloves off and slipped out of the bathroom, walking silently back down the carpeted hallway. Instead of returning directly to the kitchen, I took a sharp detour toward the large laundry room and mudroom located just off the spacious garage. Derek was a creature of absolute habit. He went to an executive gym 3 times a week, and he always dumped his sweaty workout gear into a specific wicker hamper by the garage door, entirely too lazy to carry it to the washing machine himself. I stepped into the dark mudroom, my eyes scanning the organized shelves and hooks. I found the wicker hamper immediately. Resting right on top of the pile was his dark gray athletic jacket, exactly where he had carelessly tossed it yesterday afternoon before the medical emergency completely derailed their entire week. I put on a fresh pair of surgical gloves and picked up the dark fabric, holding it up toward the dim security light, filtering in through the garage window. I scrutinized the collar and the inner lining with intense focus. It only took me 30 seconds to find exactly what I needed. Woven into the sweaty fabric near the high neckline were 2 distinct dark brown hairs. I pulled a pair of small metal tweezers from my pocket, gripped the very tips of the hairs, and carefully plucked them from the jacket lining. I held them up to the light, confirming that the tiny whitish biological root follicles were still perfectly intact at the base. It was more than enough biological material for a definitive match. I dropped the 2 hairs into the second sterile plastic bag, sealed it tight, and placed it securely next to the toothbrush in my coat pocket. I took off the gloves, smoothed out the wrinkles in my overcoat, and walked casually back into the sprawling kitchen. Derek was pouring the warm soup into porcelain bowls. I smiled warmly, played the role of the tired, deeply relieved grandfather for another 10 minutes, and gracefully excused myself, claiming that the long, emotional day had finally caught up with my aging body. They watched me walk out the front door, completely unaware that I was walking away with the absolute destruction of their entire carefully constructed world safely tucked inside my pocket. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove out of their pristine suburban neighborhood, but I did not drive back to my empty house. I turned my car onto the dark interstate highway and pressed the accelerator down. I drove straight through the dark night to a private genetics laboratory located 2 towns over. I had called them during my drive, utilizing a premium emergency service line to arrange a deeply confidential after-hours appointment. I arrived at the sleek, unmarked medical building just past 2 in the morning. A stern-looking laboratory technician in a white coat let me in through the heavy glass security doors. I handed him the 2 perfectly sealed plastic bags and a thick envelope containing exactly $5,000 in crisp, clean, untraceable cash. I demanded a highly expedited priority analysis today. The young technician counted the cash very carefully, labeled the plastic bags with random numerical barcodes to ensure complete anonymity, and promised me definitive, legally binding results within 48 hours. Soon I walked out of the private clinic. As the first faint streaks of purple dawn broke across the eastern horizon, the biting morning chill whipped my face, but I felt a strange burning heat radiating deep within my chest. I had the biological evidence secured. The scientific hammer was officially in motion. I unlocked my car and slid into the cold leather driver's seat, letting out a long, heavy breath. I reached into my pocket for my keys, but my fingers brushed against my smartphone. The screen suddenly lit up the dark interior of the car, vibrating violently against the palm of my hand. It was an automated security alert triggered directly from the secret digital backdoor I had coded into the Caldwell Logistics server 10 years ago. I stared at the glowing text, feeling the blood freeze completely solid in my veins. Someone inside the company was attempting to authorize a massive, unapproved wire transfer of $4.5 million. Desperately trying to use my personal digital signature to do it, I threw my car into gear and tore out of the clinic parking lot. The sun was fully rising now, painting the morning sky in vibrant streaks of orange and gold, but my world had never felt colder or darker. My mind raced faster than the engine of my car. Whoever was sitting at a computer terminal, attempting to push that massive wire transfer through the Caldwell Logistics system, was getting desperate. They were trying to bypass the primary authentication protocols by using a forged version of my digital footprint. I did not drive back to the corporate headquarters. Confronting Bradley, or whoever was sitting at that desk, would only give them the opportunity to scrub the servers and destroy the digital evidence before I could secure it. I drove straight back to my house, the large, empty home that felt more like a mausoleum than a sanctuary. I bypassed the kitchen and walked down the long hallway to my private home office. I locked the heavy door behind me and closed the thick wooden blinds, plunging the room into shadows. I turned on my desk lamp and sat down in front of my secure home terminal. 10 years ago, when Caldwell Logistics was rapidly expanding, and we were fending off aggressive corporate espionage from rival logistics firms, I hired a brilliant independent programmer to build a failsafe into our network architecture. It was a digital ghost, a completely invisible back door coded directly into the foundational framework of the company servers. I never told Diane about it, and I certainly never told Derek or the board of directors. It was my ultimate insurance policy designed for a catastrophic scenario just like this one. I booted up the terminal and typed in a complex sequence of commands that had not been used in a decade. The screen flashed black, then flooded with cascading lines of green code. I was in. I navigated through the invisible pathways of the network, bypassing the heavily advertised corporate firewalls without triggering a single alarm. I located the active terminal that had initiated the security alert. It was registered to the executive financial suite. Bradley Jenkins was already awake and working early, furiously trying to force a heavily encrypted wire transfer through the system using a spoofed credential package designed to mimic my authorization. I watched his digital keystrokes in real time like a phantom observing a burglar trying to pick a lock. Bradley was a slick, calculating accountant, but his understanding of deep network architecture was arrogant and fundamentally flawed. He had established a series of internal lockouts to blind the general accounting staff and block my standard administrative access. But his walls were built on the surface level. He had absolutely no idea that I was swimming beneath the foundation of his digital fortress. With a few precise keystrokes, I isolated his transfer request and quietly quarantined the transaction, suspending the $4.5 million in a hidden digital purgatory, where he could neither complete the transfer nor cancel the footprint of his attempt. I had him perfectly trapped. My heart pounded with a mix of fury and intense focus as I prepared to dig deeper into the system. I needed to see exactly how long this disease had been spreading through my company, and I needed to gather every single piece of undeniable evidence before they realized they were caught. Having stopped the immediate financial hemorrhage, I turned my attention to the origin of the rot. I needed to see exactly how deep this infection went. I traced the destination of the blocked wire transfer, following the complex routing numbers, through a dizzying maze of offshore routing protocols and disguised corporate entities. What I found was a sophisticated, highly organized labyrinth of financial fraud. Bradley had not just been skimming off the top. He had engineered a massive systemic pipeline designed to drain the lifeblood of my company. I uncovered 4 distinct shell companies, all recently registered in the state of Delaware under fake limited liability corporations. They had generic, meaningless names that blended perfectly into a standard corporate expense report: Global Freight Solutions, Apex Logistics Consulting, Horizon Management, Partners, and Zenith Supply Chain Associates. I opened the accounting ledgers connected to these phantom companies. The digital paper trail revealed a relentless barrage of fabricated invoices for phantom consulting services and non-existent software upgrades and dummy logistical routes that Caldwell Logistics had supposedly subcontracted. The sheer volume of the fake invoices was staggering, but they were carefully calculated to slide just beneath the threshold of an automatic secondary board review. Bradley had meticulously orchestrated the payments to look like standard operational expenses, masking the theft behind a wall of tedious corporate bureaucracy. I began downloading every single ledger, every fake invoice, and every routing number onto my secure hard drive, ensuring I had a permanent, unalterable record of their massive criminal enterprise. The depth of the deception was sickening, revealing a level of calculated greed that completely shattered any lingering illusions I had about the people operating within my own corporate headquarters. I dug deeper, matching the dates of the fraudulent invoices with the corresponding outflow of corporate capital. I pulled up the master ledger of the company and cross-referenced the missing capital against our internal accounts. When the numbers finally aligned on my glowing screen, a wave of profound nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the edge of my desk to steady myself. The money was not coming from our operational revenue. It was not coming from our expansion reserves. The $4.5 million that Bradley and Monica had siphoned away over the past 8 months was being systematically drained directly from the employee pension fund. They were stealing the hard-earned retirement savings of the truck drivers, warehouse managers, and logistics coordinators who had dedicated their lives to building this company alongside me. But the absolute worst part was the timeline. I stared at the dates of the largest outgoing wire transfers, feeling a sharp, twisting agony in my chest. The first massive withdrawal was initiated 8 months ago. That was exactly the same week Diane received her terminal cancer diagnosis. While I was sitting in sterile oncology waiting rooms, holding my dying wife's fragile hand and crying over her hospital bed, my daughter-in-law and my chief financial officer were busy plundering the company vaults. They knew I was completely distracted by grief and medical decisions. They knew my attention was entirely focused on the woman I loved more than life itself. They weaponized my pain and used Diane's tragic decline as a convenient, prolonged distraction to orchestrate their massive thust. Every time Monica visited the hospice facility, she was calculating how much more she could steal. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the glow of the computer monitor illuminating the dark room. The pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking together with terrifying clarity. The massive embezzlement of the pension fund, the fake Delaware corporations, the desperate panicked attempt to push a final wire transfer through the system at dawn, and the sudden aggressive push for me to sign the succession documents mere days after Diane's funeral. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the thick manila folder. Monica had slammed onto my kitchen counter the day before, the emergency handover and succession agreement. I flipped past the first few pages of legal jargon regarding executive powers and skipped directly to the final clauses buried at the very end of the extensive document. There it was, hidden beneath layers of dense corporate terminology. A comprehensive indemnification clause completely absolving the new executive board of any prior financial discrepancies, and a mandatory authorization for the upcoming end-of-year audit bearing my signature as the sole approving authority. The handover document was never about taking power. It was never about Monica wanting to rule the company from the shadows. The document was a meticulously crafted legal shield. The end-of-year corporate audit was scheduled to begin in less than 3 weeks. An independent auditing firm would tear through the company ledgers, and it would take them less than an hour to notice a gaping $4.5 million hole in the employee pension fund. When the federal investigators inevitably arrived to comb through the wreckage, they would demand answers. They would look at the digital authorization logs. They would see the spoofed credentials holding my digital signature. And if I signed that handover document, I would be legally authenticating all financial operations prior to the transfer of power. Monica and Bradley were not just stealing my money. They were meticulously framing me for the entire operation. They intended to use my signature to bury the massive embezzlement entirely under my name. They needed my signature to seal my coffin, and they were willing to use my grief to get it. They vastly underestimated the man they were trying to destroy. The hours following my discovery in the digital shadows of Caldwell Logistics dragged on with suffocating slowness. I paralyzed Bradley Jenkins and his frantic attempt to transfer $4.5 million, freezing the stolen pension funds in a void. But that was only the financial battlefield. The biological war was still waging silently, waiting for science to deliver its indisputable verdict. I stayed locked inside my dimly lit home office for 2 days. I ignored the relentless phone calls from my son Derek, who was growing increasingly anxious about my delayed response to the succession agreement. I ignored the demanding text messages from Monica, who was wondering why her perfectly laid trap had not yet snapped shut. I needed to maintain total silence. To react now without having every piece of the puzzle firmly locked into place would be a catastrophic tactical error. I drank bitter black coffee and stared at the walls, my mind compartmentalizing the betrayal into manageable, actionable pieces. Finally, on the morning of the 3rd day, the secure burner phone resting on my desk vibrated violently. It was a local number, the private genetics laboratory I visited under the cover of darkness. I answered the call immediately, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "Mr. Caldwell," a sterile professional voice said through the speaker, "we have completed the expedited analysis on the biological samples you provided. The comprehensive results have been compiled, verified, and sealed. They are ready for immediate physical pickup at our front desk." I did not ask for the results over the phone. I needed to hold the physical document in my hands. I thanked the technician, disconnected the call, and grabbed my heavy wool overcoat. The final nail in the coffin of my family was waiting for me. The drive to the private clinic felt vastly different in the stark light of the morning sun. When I had driven this exact route 3 nights ago, I was a man fueled by desperate, frantic suspicion, navigating the busy suburban streets and watching normal people go about their mundane daily routines. I was a man marching toward an inevitable execution. I parked my truck in the sleek, unmarked lot of the medical building and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The clinical white walls of the lobby offered no comfort. I approached the reception desk, and provided the anonymous numerical barcodes the technician had assigned to my plastic bags. The receptionist, a young woman who looked entirely too cheerful for a place that routinely delivered life-destroying news, checked her computer terminal and retrieved a thick, tamper-proof manila envelope from a locked filing cabinet. She slid it across the counter, completely unaware of the absolute devastation sealed inside its thick paper walls. I took the envelope, feeling its heavy physical weight in my hands. I did not open it in the lobby. I needed the absolute privacy of my own space. I walked back out through the sliding glass doors, the automated hum sounding unnaturally loud in my ears. I climbed into the driver's seat of my truck, closed the heavy door, and locked it. I started the engine, letting the deep rhythmic rumble of the motor fill the insulated cabin. The heater blew warm air over my cold hands, but it did absolutely nothing to thaw the freezing ice that had firmly settled into my chest. I sat in the idling truck for a long time, staring at the blank face of the envelope resting on the passenger seat. Inside that paper casing was the absolute scientific truth of my bloodline. I had spent 18 years looking at Chase, searching for traces of my own facial features in his adolescent face, looking for Diane's bright smile in his expressions, looking for my own relentless drive in his actions. Now I was about to find out if I had been searching for ghosts. I took a deep, steadying breath, reached over, and picked up the envelope. I slid my index finger under the sealed flap and tore it open with one swift, decisive motion. I pulled out the crisp white laboratory report. The document was dense with complex genetic markers, biological sequencing charts, and technical medical jargon, but I bypassed the complicated data and let my eyes drop directly to the bold capitalized conclusion printed clearly at the very bottom of the final page. Probability of paternity 0.00%. The biological samples provided from Subject A do not share a paternal genetic relationship with the biological samples provided from Subject B. The subject known as Chase is excluded as the biological offspring of the subject known as Derek. I read the numbers again, 0.00%. There was no margin for error. There was no statistical anomaly. It was a complete, undeniable, biological zero. The teenage boy I had loved, spoiled and prepared to inherit my $15 million empire was an absolute stranger. He did not possess a single drop of Caldwell blood. Diane's sacred lineage, the family legacy we had worked so incredibly hard to secure, had died the moment my wife took her final breath in that hospice bed. For exactly 1 minute, a wave of profound, crushing grief washed over me. I mourned the loss of my grandchild. I mourned the absolute deception that had robbed me of a true legacy. I grieved for Diane, thanking whatever higher power existed that she had passed away before having to witness this sickening betrayal. But the grief did not last. It was almost instantly eradicated, burned away by a cold, calculating, and utterly terrifying rage. The sorrow was completely eclipsed by the sharp, focused clarity of a man who had just realized he was surrounded by vicious predators. I folded the laboratory report perfectly in half and placed it securely into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. My mind, rigorously trained by decades of ruthless corporate warfare, began to rapidly process the new variables of the battlefield. If Derek was not the biological father of the boy, then who was? Monica was a highly calculating, incredibly ambitious woman. She would not risk her extremely comfortable, heavily subsidized lifestyle on a random, meaningless affair with a stranger. If she was going to commit an infidelity that could potentially destroy her lucrative marriage to the heir of a logistics empire, she would do it with someone useful, someone who could actively help her achieve her ultimate goal of absolute financial control. She would partner with someone who understood exactly how to manipulate massive sums of money without triggering internal corporate alarms. She would partner with someone who had deep, unrestricted access to the complex financial architecture of Caldwell Logistics. The realization struck me with the force of a speeding freight train, the missing $4. $5 million from the employee pension fund, the fake shell companies registered in Delaware, the frantic early morning attempt to push a massive wire transfer through the system using my spoofed digital signature. Monica was not orchestrating this massive corporate embezzlement all by herself. She had a highly skilled, deeply embedded partner on the inside. I pulled out of the medical clinic parking lot, my destination firmly set. I was not going back to the office, and I was not going home. I was going to war, and I needed a soldier to gather my ammunition. I drove to a nondescript office building located in the industrial district on the very edge of the city. I walked through the doors and stepped into the sparse utilitarian office of Robert Sanchez. Robert was an ex-federal agent, a man who had spent 20 years hunting down white-collar criminals and dismantling organized syndicates before transitioning into highly lucrative, strictly confidential private investigation. He was ruthless, incredibly efficient, and entirely devoid of moral hesitation when properly compensated. I sat down in the uncomfortable chair across from his metal desk. I did not offer any pleasantries. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my checkbook, and signed a blank check. I slid the crisp piece of paper across the metal desk, leaving the financial amount completely empty. Robert looked at the blank check, his dark eyes narrowing with intense professional curiosity. "I need you to dig up every single shadow Monica ever cast, both before and after she managed to marry my son." I instructed, my voice hard and unforgiving like cracked ice. "Leave absolutely no stone unturned. I want to know where she spends her afternoons, what she buys, and exactly who she meets when she thinks nobody is looking. I want her entire life completely dismantled and laid bare on my desk." Robert slowly picked up the blank check, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his weathered face. "Where exactly would you like me to start, Mr. Caldwell?" he asked quietly. I leaned forward, the cold rage burning brightly in my chest. "Start with Bradley Jenkins." I spent the next 3 days walking through my life like a ghost. I went to the office, attended meetings, and reviewed quarterly projections as if the ground beneath me had not completely collapsed. I nodded at Bradley Jenkins when we passed in the hallway, offering him the same polite, professional smile I had given him for years. I answered Derek's increasingly anxious phone calls regarding the succession documents, assuring him in a weary, defeated voice that I just needed a little more time to finalize my affairs. Every word I spoke was a carefully calculated performance. I was a man standing in the center of a burning room, calmly adjusting his tie while quietly bolting all the doors from the inside. They believed they were watching a powerful man slowly fade into irrelevance due to the overwhelming grief of losing his wife. They had no idea they were actually watching a predator patiently arranging his killing floor. On the evening of the third day, my burner phone finally buzzed. It was a single text message from Robert Sanchez containing an address for a 24-hour diner located on the industrial outskirts of the city and a specific time. I arrived 15 minutes early, pulling my truck into the dimly lit, pothole-ridden parking lot. The diner was a relic from another era, smelling strongly of stale fryer grease and cheap black coffee. Robert was already sitting in a sticky vinyl booth tucked far away in the back corner, completely hidden from the large front windows. He was nursing a mug of black coffee, his face an unreadable mask of professional stoicism. As I slid into the booth across from him, he did not offer a greeting. He simply reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. He slid it slowly across the scarred laminate table until it bumped gently against my folded hands. "You were absolutely right to start with Bradley Jenkins." "Mr. Caldwell?" Robert said, his voice a low, growly murmur that barely carried over the ambient hum of the diner's old refrigerator units. They were not exceptionally careful. Arrogance rarely is. I stared at the thick dossier. My fingers rested lightly on the rough paper, feeling the profound weight of the secrets locked inside. I opened the cover. The very first page was a high-resolution photograph date stamped just 3 weeks ago. It showed Monica and Bradley sitting close together at a secluded table in a high-end out-of-town restaurant. Bradley was leaning in his hand, resting intimately over hers, their faces close in private animated conversation.